This year marks the 300th year since the birth of Adam Smith, who's usually referred to as the founder of economics. Born on June 5th, 1723, Adam Smith was part of what is known as the Scottish Enlightenment. His books, Theory of Moral Sentiment and The Wealth of Nations, are still taught today in schools. Today, Adam Smith's name is invoked frequently in order to promote laissez-faire capitalism and the power of the market's invisible hand. But my guest argues that this notion of Adam Smith is much more about the people who invoked his name over the centuries after his death than the man himself or his works. Glory Liu is my guest. She joins me for a conversation on how this philosopher, Adam Smith, became a metaphoric champion of capitalism. Glory Liu is a lecturer in social studies at Harvard University, and she is the author of the book that we'll be talking about. It's called Adam Smith's America: How a Scottish Philosopher Became an Icon of American Capitalism. Glory Liu, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this radio program.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I think, again, I said in my introduction, oftentimes Adam Smith is referred to as the founder of economics, quote unquote, the father of capitalism. It's probably important to note about the man himself in his time. He wasn't seen as either.
That's right. Smith is a philosopher of the Scottish Enlightenment. I can give you a quick overview of his life and the times he lived in, and then we can talk a little bit about the intellectual and cultural context of the Scottish Enlightenment. And I think you'll discover that Smith is quite far from being that father of free market capitalism that he's often so referred to today. So Smith lived in the 18th century. He was born in 1723 in this small Scottish seaside town called Kirkcaldy. Looks like Kirkcaldy to us, but I recently learned that it's pronounced Kirkcaldy. He attends the University of Glasgow. He then goes on to Oxford, to Balliol College in 1740. He then returns to Scotland and lectures in Edinburgh as a kind of freelance lecturer between 1746 and 1751. 1752, he returns to Glasgow, this time as a professor, and he's a professor of moral philosophy beginning in 1752. So that should immediately strike people as, oh, that's different, right? This is not a professor of economics. That's right. The term economics and the discipline of economics didn't exist at Smith's time. He became a professor of moral philosophy. He later takes up this post as the tutor to a young duke, the Duke of Buccleuch, who is the stepson of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend. So for Americans listening to this program, that name, Charles Townshend, should maybe ring a bell because he's the architect of the Townshend Acts, one of those, infamous acts that kind of was a spur for the American Revolution. So as tutor, Smith is taking this young duke around Europe in the 1760s, 1764 to 1766. He encounters these French luminaries of the French Enlightenment and a group of economists known as the physiocrats. And this really expands Smith's thinking about issues of moral and political economy, or I should say moral philosophy and political economy. He returns to England and Scotland, and he begins writing The Wealth of Nations in 1770. Well, he begins writing it in the 1760s, but it's published in 1776. And then later in his life, he becomes a customs officer, retires in Edinburgh, lives a pretty kind of quiet life. Right before he dies in 1790, he orders that all of his remaining manuscripts be burned. And this is kind of like one of the most astonishing and frustrating facts about Smith's life for scholars who like studying him, right? He had planned two other great works, in addition to his work on moral philosophy, the theory of moral sentiments, and The Wealth of Nations. He had planned to write a book on law and government, and another book on kind of literature and poetry and the arts. And whatever he had written on that, he had burned right before he died. So that's a kind of a really fast overview of Smith's life. In many ways, it's fascinating because he lived in really interesting times, right? He saw the rise of modern commercial economies. Scotland went from being a real kind of hinterland country to being one really booming with international commerce. He saw those social transformations happening, and he lived during a period of really rich cultural and intellectual flourishing and scientific progress. But in other ways, Smith's life isn't that remarkable, right? He's like an elite man of letters. He goes to university, he teaches at a university, travels around Europe for a while, and then he kind of quietly exits. He's a very private person. We don't have much correspondence. He's not somebody who causes a lot of scandal. But he's pretty well loved, but he's a very private person.
He likes being at home.
He does. He
Yeah.
lives with his mom.
Almost remind me like of The Hobbit.
Yes, he lives with his mom. He never marries. We don't even know if he ever fell in love. He doesn't take any mistresses for all we know. He doesn't have any children. The only woman he really loved in his life was his mom, Margaret Douglas.
Do you have a sense of why he may have burned his papers before he died?
There's a lot of speculation about this. Some attribute it to Smith's kind of perfectionist tendencies, that he didn't want anything published unless it was really perfect. And he articulates that sentiment to, his publisher. I believe it's his publisher multiple times when he says, like, I'm kind of like anxious about sending you something that's incomplete or not perfect. And he says, like, I've written this over half a dozen or so more times and I'm still not satisfied. Like, he very much is a perfectionist. He's very fastidious with his work. So some people attribute it to that kind of tendency, his own personality. But I think there are some people who also think that Smith might have had some very controversial ideas and he didn't want them to be known. He saw the way that his best friend, David Hume, another, one of the greatest philosophers to have ever lived and also came out of the Scottish Enlightenment. Hume was ridiculed during his life for being not just a skepticist, but many people thought, blasphemous, maybe an even atheist. How could you believe those things? And when Smith published a eulogy of David Hume, that was what earned him, he even said, more ridicule than his attempt to attack the whole commercial system of Great Britain and the wealth of nations. So Smith was very aware of the way your posthumous reputation could kind of be tanked based on what you believed. And I think there's some reason to believe that Smith might have had some very controversial opinions, right? Like, he was a supporter of the American Revolution, in the sense that he believed that the colonies had really good reason to be independent unless they were going to join a fiscal union and have representation in parliament. That would put him in the minority. He was very anti-slavery. Again, minority opinion in the 18th century. So I think there's also good reason to believe that, he might have wanted to just not have those opinions known.
He was also a major critic of just the British colonial enterprise itself.
Oh, yes. I mean, that's something that I didn't emphasize enough, that he was, just incredible. I'm like struggling to come up with the words to describe how angry he was at the violence and the oppression of the British East India Company and the very project of empire. I mean, the critique at the end of The Wealth of Nations of the project of British Empire is withering.
That's interesting, because the British East India Company is a major player in the formation of early capitalism, right? So here we're talking about Adam Smith, but Adam Smith is somebody who sounds like he despised the British East India Company.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Tell me more about David Hume and David Hume's influence on Adam Smith. And David Hume is considered, I guess, what we call an empiricist. What does that mean, and why does that matter?
Yeah, and I want to just plug the work of my colleague, Dennis Rasmussen, a political theorist who wrote a phenomenal book on the life and the friendship of David Hume and Adam Smith. It's called The Infidel and the Professor. I think the subtitle is something like The Friendship That Shaped Modern Thought or something, but it's about the friendship and the kind of intellectual, intertwined lives of David Hume and Adam Smith. I'll be brief just because this is not my real realm of expertise, but Hume is the single most important intellectual influence on Smith's life, and Hume is everywhere in Smith's thought. Hume, I think, gives us the best understanding of what it means to be an Enlightenment social theorist in the Scottish Enlightenment. He has this idea of a kind of science of man, that when you look out in the world and you observe, you use the word empiricism, based on our observations, mankind appears so similar. Right? There are certain kind of features of human behavior and human action that appear over and over again. And if you observe the human record or you look out in the world in front of you, you can deduce some of these kind of underlying general principles as if you were observing features of the natural world. And And so Hume is really one of these great fathers of what we might call the Enlightenment science of man, and really provides a model for doing that, not only about the structures of our mind and morality, and the kind of different features of human nature, but also of political economy, politics, and history. And that really is probably the single most important thing to know about kind of Hume's influence on Smith, that he's like the model for doing this Enlightenment science of man. Hume and Smith differ to some extent, although there's a debate in scholarship about just how much on their beliefs about religion. I think the other thing that's important is when we think about Smith's view of politics and how we study politics, a lot of that also comes from Hume. Right? The basis of politics is utility, right? That there's this that like to have a government in the first place, the government should have some kind of does something that's generally useful. That's this idea of utility, not like utilitarianism utility, but there's some general utility about having government. And there's also a basis in authority. Government provides some kind of authority. And those two ideas, utility and authority, come from Hume. Smith has a critique of utility that I won't go into because it's a little bit niche, but you can see that influence of Hume on Smith in almost everything that Smith writes.
What is Adam Smith trying to get at in his works? His two major books are The Theory of Moral Sentiment, that's written early on, The Wealth of Nations much later. So these aren't like back-to-back kind of pieces of work. But how would you summarize Adam Smith's work? What is he trying to get at?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to kind of break down the titles of both of these works and to understand the central questions that animate them. So The Theory of Moral Sentiments is Smith's first major work, published in 1759. What does Smith mean by theory? Well, it's not a theory that's like a normative theory. He's not saying this is what I think constitutes justice or this is what I think constitutes the good life. He's offering more of a descriptive, or you might even say explanatory theory of where does morality come from. Or some people say it's a kind of moral phenomenology, even, that he's really charting all the different ways in which we experience moral encounters and moral judgments. And that kind of theory is really unique. It's a really unique product of this 18th century moment in doing moral philosophy. Okay, so then the second word, theory of moral sentiments. Moral here is something closer to what we might call social or psychological rather than purely ethical. Moral philosophy is used in contrast to natural philosophy. So we're talking about the human world and the social world, not the natural world. And sentiments. Sentiments are something closer to feelings or emotions, but they're also not pure feelings or emotions. And the central question that Smith is trying to address, there are actually two central questions. One is, are humans naturally selfish, or are they benevolent? Right. This is a huge debate in moral philosophy, stretching all the way back to, you could say, the 17th century. And then the second question is morality grounded in reason or in sentiment, right? Is it something that we deduce from reason, or is it something that's kind of innate to our feelings? And there are a lot of different interlocutors in this debate. So Smith's teacher, Francis Hutcheson, believed that morality came from sentiment, but it was grounded in this sense that he called the moral sense, almost like any of our other primary senses. Just like we have a sense of taste or a sense of smell, we also have a moral sense that tells us what's right and wrong. Now, Smith doesn't think that we have a separate sense, but he does think that there is something about the way we experience sentiments and feelings and passions that are moral and social processes that tell us what the general rules of morality are. And for Smith, morality is fundamentally a social thing. It is because we are products of society. It's because we live in society, because we learn to sympathize with other people. We learn to see ourselves and evaluate our own actions and behaviors and motivations by thinking about how we appear to others. So that's kind of the theory of moral sentiments from a really, really, really high bird's eye view. Now, The Wealth of Nations is written in 1776, or I should say it's published in 1776. And Smith had kind of begun working out all these ideas much earlier. And I think it's also worth unpacking kind of like the title, right? It's an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. That's the full title. We call it the wealth of nations, but it's an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. So first of all, it's an inquiry, right? He's exploring something. He's
not creating something.
Right. He's not making a manifesto. It's also not a textbook about the wealth of nations. Or it's not a pamphlet. It's an inquiry. Nature and causes. So what is what is national wealth? Like, what is it fundamentally? Where does it come from? And what causes it to increase or decrease, or what thwarts its progress? And also, it's about national wealth, not individual wealth. I think today we tend to think of economics as a science of values and a science that's that kind of revolves around the individual as the primary unit of analysis. If you just look at the title of Smith's works, he's interested in the wealth of nations. So that should already kind of give you a sense that this is not your typical Econ 101 textbook that you're reading. Right? This is Smith thinking about economic life and political economy in the 18th century. One thing that I also like to kind of highlight is that the structure of the Wealth of Nations also reveals a lot about its contents and its purpose. So in books 1 and book 2 of the Wealth of Nations, this is like over 1,000 pages, by the way, right? I don't expect most people to have read all 1,000 pages of The Wealth of Nations. Most of us read excerpts. But I think it's worth paying attention to just how this book is structured. So in books 1 and books 2, Smith reveals how the kind of foundations of national wealth are in things like the division of labor, right? Where does wealth come from? Where does productivity come from? What are the bases of things like prices and wages and rent? We might call these the foundations of microeconomics. So where is wealth created? Division of labor. Book 1. Book 2 is really about stock and capital. That's how wealth flows and how it accumulates. Book 3 is really interesting because Smith turns to the history of modern Europe from the fall of the Roman Empire onward. And most people might read this and go, what on earth is happening here? Like, where's the rest of the econ textbook? Why is Smith talking about the Gothic invasions and feudal property rights? And it's because Smith is interested in showing how history doesn't often follow pure economic logic. Like, we might have this preconceived idea of how nations are supposed to progress from, say, hunter-gatherers to more advanced societies. And he says, well, if you look at the history of modern Europe, it's totally inverted, right? He says unnatural and retrograde order of things in Europe. And so he's trying to explain, right? Like, how is it that humans and human progress and this kind of societal progress goes wrong? And history shows us that
after the fall of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, after the fall,
quote unquote. You're not supposed to use this term anymore, but what you once called the Dark Ages.
Right, exactly. And so I think what's so interesting about book 3 is that Smith is really just trying to show how fragile of an achievement what we call modern, kind of a modern commercial society is, right? Like, how is it that the rule of law actually guarantees security and economic development? Well, it kind of happened by accident, and it was really violent, and it was also in this kind of historically constrained time. So in any case, that's my digression on book 3. Very different. Again, probably not something you're going to encounter in your Econ 101 class. Book 4 is where Smith starts to critique what I call political economic ideology. This is where he goes after the East India Company and what he calls the mercantile system, or the commercial system of Great Britain, as well as the ideology of the French economists called the physiocrats, this idea that national wealth is found in the produce of the land and only in agriculture, not in manufacturing. And Smith has, problems with both of these systems. And he really tries to show that both systems, whether you think that wealth is based on the amount of gold and coin that you can hoard, as in the mercantile system, or whether you think that wealth comes only from agricultural products, he says both of these ideas are flawed. But look at the way that they're institutionalized in these different countries, and you'll see just how kind of oppressive both ideologies can be. And so that's why he's trying to say, if we have liberalized free trade, and if we didn't try to kind of use the state in order to implement a kind of narrow-minded ideology, we might actually be better off. And I want to be really clear that Smith is not attacking government whatsoever, right? But he's attacking, especially in his critique of the mercantile system, he's attacking the way in which wealthy elite merchants end up capturing the government and bending the law to their will in order to rig markets in their favor, right? So it's more a theory of it's more a critique of state capture than it is against just the state full sail. And that's, I think, a really important distinction that gets lost when we think of Smith as kind of champion of laissez-faire, right? Anti-government. And it's not at all what he was about. Finally, we get to book 5 of The Wealth of Nations, which is one of the longest books. And this is where Smith is really talking about kind of principles of sound policymaking, everything from support of public education to national defense and taxation regimes. And he also kind of goes on and talks about colonial policy as well. And then we get his critique of like the project of empire at the very end of The Wealth of Nations. So I hope that gives people a sense of just how different Smith's time was and how different and diverse of a thinker he was. And you know, if they're interested, pick up one of these books.
This is Letters on Politics, and today we are in conversation about Adam Smith, what his ideas were and how his ideas have been used and even changed as the ages have gone on. Our guest is Glory Liu. Glory Liu is a lecturer in social studies at Harvard University, and she is the author of the book that we are in conversation about. It's called Adam Smith's America, How a Scottish Philosopher Became an Icon of American Capitalism. Oftentimes we think of Adam Smith being used by conservatives and the right wing. However, he also has been used by more progressive economists over time as well. And maybe this is an oversimplification, but it seems like progressives pay more attention, which is not nearly as read, to his first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiment, whereas maybe more pro-capitalist free market economists pay more attention to Wealth of Nations. Is that at all accurate?
I think it would be fair to say it's somewhat accurate today. But I do think what's surprising about the way Smith is read today is that you do have a convergence from both, you could say, the progressive and conservative readings of Smith onto Smith as both a theorist of what you want to call capitalism, as well as a theorist of morality. And what's interesting about that convergence is that there's this tendency to read Smith as like, oh, he's a moral philosopher and he's an economist. Let's read what the morality part is and see if we can kind of massage it to fit our version of what we think morality is that aligns with our kind of political commitments. So this is a kind of oversimplification, but there's these categories that we call like left Smith and right Smith, or left Smithian and right Smithian today. And, the left Smithian version goes something like this, right? That like Smith was deeply concerned about not only the material and political consequences of economic inequality, but also with the moral consequences of inequality. He was really concerned with the corruption of our moral sentiments. He cared deeply about poverty, and he was really concerned with kind of, excess profit extraction at the very, very top. And he also believed that there was room for the state to kind of use policy making to achieve the ends of distributive justice. That's maybe the left Smith reading. Okay? And you can see how that might fit some kind of like contemporary progressive sensibility. And then on the right Smithian reading, you have much more emphasis on, and surprisingly, the power of free markets, decentralization, Smith's skepticism of centralized authority, public and private, his skepticism of politicians' capacity to do the right thing and do things for the public good, and that kind of tendency towards capture. Although I would say that last point is kind of like tendency towards capture is something that I think goes above left-right distinctions. In any case, I do think that there's room in both the right and the left readings where you can see how your understanding of Smith's morality, I'm using scare quotes for those who can't see me, and his moral philosophy somehow aligns with their preferred vision of what a like healthy liberal capitalist society looks like. I don't think that's unusual, by the way. I don't think it's unusual that you see these different versions of Smith that appeal to his authority as both a political economic thinker as well as somebody who wrote a work on moral philosophy. I've said this in other places too, but I think it's as tempting as it is to use Smith's theory of moral sentiments to say, oh, well, if Smith wrote a book on moral philosophy, you know, Adam Smith, the father of economics, if he wrote a book on moral philosophy, capitalism must be moral. That's not at all what the theory of moral sentiments is about. But I do think that it is important to realize that Smith was a really far-reaching thinker, and his work on moral philosophy does inform the way we read The Wealth of Nations, but that in no way means that that's an endorsement of capitalism as a moral system, if you see what I mean there.
Adam Smith is frequently considered, again, sort of the founder of capitalism. Is that accurate? Would that be an accurate statement?
I would say no. I would say that Smith is one of the most original thinkers and theorists of the birth of the modern economy. And modern economy for him, from his point of view, writing in the 18th century, from Scotland and England and France, he's looking at the birth of what he calls commercial society, right? A society where the primary mode of subsistence is not self-sufficient agriculture, and it's also not feudalism, but people meet their needs through relationships of mutual exchange. And when people meet their needs through relationships of mutual exchange, the social fabric of society begins to change, and new forms of political authority are introduced. So whereas earlier forms of society, hunter-gathering or nomadic societies, political authority might have found its basis in physical strength or mental capacities, or just the oldest person in the tribe. Smith sees that commercial societies introduce a new form of power through wealth, right? The wealthiest person now can wield another form of influence because they have the most stuff. And so Smith is an original theorist of how new forms of power emerge when wealth is produced. And commercial societies are uniquely capable of producing wealth. And that's what I think makes him so interesting. It's not just capitalism is one way of managing wealth and power.
He saw concerns about the accumulation of wealth. He thought the system can get out of whack. And in fact, I've heard it, and you'll let me know what you think about this, but I've heard other Smith scholars say that if he were to see the world today, he would think that this is exactly what has happened. The dynamic is off in how the world economy works.
Yeah, in a nutshell, Smith thought that a well-functioning economy was one in which profits are low and wages are high. So you shouldn't see massive gains at the top, right? You should see low profits and high wages. No rent seeking, in other words, or minimal rent seeking. And I think that there's a lot of what Smith couldn't have predicted, right? Smith is writing before the Industrial Revolution. He's writing before you have right before these massive technological changes, like, you know, the patent for the steam engine by James Watt is, I think he applies for the patent right around the same time as Smith is writing, but it hasn't quite taken off yet. So there's a lot that Smith could not have predicted, right? He couldn't have predicted the advent of like finance capitalism the way we see it now. But he did worry about wild speculation. You know, he witnessed the South Seas bubble, which is a crisis that I can barely wrap my mind around, right? But you know, another one of these crazy investment schemes to send ships to South America and bring back riches, and was seen as kind of too big to fail. And of course it did fail, right? And Smith was incredibly attuned to the way in which that could really throw an entire economy, taking along the kind of most vulnerable with it. Right? So Smith is highly attuned to the ways in which economies can get warped by one group or another to the detriment of the most vulnerable.
Glory Liu, again, your book is called Adam Smith's America, How a Scottish Philosopher Became an Icon of American Capitalism. Let's talk about Adam Smith and the history of the United States. You really dive into the 19th century in which the United States is embroiled in a big debate concerning free trade. And you write that Adam Smith is invoked by both those who are in support of free trade and those who are against it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Smith has really become an intellectual authority as the father of the science of political economy at this time. And what that does is that it allows politicians, especially. So in this chapter, I'm really looking at the way that legislators, like ordinary rank and file legislators, are debating this incredibly divisive issue of tariffs and using Smith's authority to stake their position. So you see people who are in support of free trade, especially in the Cotton South before the Civil War, saying, look, the science of political economy is supposed to be this universal science. And the father of the science, Adam Smith, offers this logic that, right, if we let our labor and capital flow to where we want it to, this will make the entire economy better off. And that logic, there's like an underlying causal logic that they're deploying. They're also using this idea that because it's this supposedly politically neutral, objective science, it should legitimate their view of what the national economy should look like. And of course, most people at the time would have understood that if you're from the Cotton South and you're a slaveholding legislator who is advancing this idea that free trade is going to be good for the nation, it's really an argument, right? But it's a kind of occluded argument of not taxing slaves and not taxing slave labor, right? So that's kind of the underlying message. For people who are,
that's what's at the heart of this debate on free trade.
Well, certainly before the Civil War, right?
Yeah.
Certainly before the Civil War, but after the Civil War, ostensibly the issue of slavery has been kind of settled, but the tariff debate is still raging, and it becomes really divisive because it's one of the few issues that really differentiates Democrats from Republicans, with Republicans being the party of protectionism and Democrats being the party of free trade after the Civil War. And you see this pattern emerge over and over again, right? The same arguments are being used, right? That free trade is going to make everybody better off. And the father of the science of political economy, Adam Smith, said so. He's the apostle of free trade. That's what the title of my chapter is called, because I think it's just such a great epithet for Smith. He's referred to as the apostle of free trade. But what's interesting, and you mentioned this in your question, is that even protectionists try to use that intellectual authority of Smith to say, well, look, even the apostle of free trade made some exceptions, right? He says, look at this quote in The Wealth of Nations where Smith says, the home market is the most important market of all. And they're being a little sneaky there because that's not really, I mean, even if Smith says the home market is the most important of all, he's saying that like under certain circumstances, there might be conditions under which free trade is not the ultimate priority, but you need to think about boosting domestic industry because they're infant industries and they don't have a competitive edge yet, or you need to worry about national defense issues. In any case, politicians can kind of play fast and loose because the point is not even to kind of dig into the substance of Smith's logic, but to really use his authority, right? Smith is a mascot at this point. And so it's really revealing that he's so much of an authority that you can use him on both sides of the debate to say our argument about free trade is legitimate because Smith gave us the science of political economy and he's on our side, versus the people who said, well, even your hero made exceptions and he's on our side too.
Interesting. Tell me about, let's move into the 20th century. Tell me about the Chicago School of Economics and its use and its economist use of Adam Smith. Is this, do you feel as though this is where we begin to see Adam Smith used more and more as sort of a conservative icon?
Certainly in the American context, yes. The way we see Smith as, the symbol of the virtues of free enterprise and the vices of government intervention, according to my reading, I think this comes from the Chicago School. And not just the Chicago School wholesale, but a particular version of the Chicago School that's attributed to people like Milton Friedman and George Stigler. So in a nutshell, the Chicago School of Economics is one of the most famous brands or schools of economics in the 20th century. I think in the popular imagination, the Chicago School stands for neoliberalism, kind of free market fundamentalism, policies of deregulation, etc. But I think amongst economists and within the profession, it's also really important that the Chicago School stands for a method. It stands for neoclassical price theory and also their orientation to other ways of doing economics, right? So they reject things like abstract mathematical formulism. They're really anti-Keynesian economics in the post-war period. But in a nutshell, the Chicago School is a brand. It's not only a method of doing economics according to neoclassical price theory, but it's also a political brand. And those two things often get conflated. And I think but I would say that conflation is important because it has consequences for how this new image of Smith is produced and the lasting effects of that image of Smith as this kind of neoliberal free market hero. So the story that I tell in my book really centers around Milton Friedman. There's a longer backstory about kind of a more complicated, nuanced Chicago school in the 1930s and 40s. But I'm going to kind of jump ahead and spotlight, I think, a figure that most people are going to be familiar with, which is Milton Friedman. So Friedman really centers on Smith's idea of the invisible hand, right? This really famous metaphor in Book 4, The Wealth of Nations. And for Friedman, the invisible hand stands for the miracle of how free markets work, right? This ability to coordinate the activity of millions of people and to promote the public good without any single person intending to or without central direction. And for Friedman, this is what he thinks is Smith's central insight. He even says this is the beginning of scientific economics. It's a flash of genius from Adam Smith. And what I think is really remarkable about Friedman in this instance, right? He was really, really gifted as a public speaker, as like a kind of master of creating slogans and images to make his version of economics really palatable and accessible to a wide audience, is that he turned that economic insight into a political idea, right? It stood for the power of free markets to protect individual freedom, especially freedom of choice, against the tyranny of government. So suddenly we get this rereading of Smith and the invisible hand as not just a kind of 18th century Scottish economist who's describing the world he's seeing in the 18th century, but a version of Smith that is so narrowly focused on pro-free market government. And like I said earlier, Smith is not at all somebody who's saying all government intervention is bad. In fact, when you look at the chapters that surround that metaphor of the invisible hand in Book 4, The Wealth of Nations, he's really talking about the difference that people, the different choices that people face when they're deciding whether to invest their capital in a domestic market versus a foreign market. And he's also talking about the danger of kind of merchant conspiracies, right? These elite merchant groups kind of colluding and kind of duping legislators, but really working with legislators to kind of get monopolistic privileges for their own companies. So this is not an analysis or an argument for anti-government, but in Friedman's telling, it sort of becomes that, because Friedman is really showing, right, it's the market or it's the tyranny of government. And we can use Smith's insight to see that. So I think that's one of the most powerful and long-lasting interpretations of Smith that we get that's associated with the politics of Milton Friedman.
Still significant today.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The quote invisible hand or the term invisible hand, it's only what, stated once in the entire work of Wealth of Nations?
Once in The Wealth of Nations, once in The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and once in Smith's essay on the history of astronomy.
And what did Adam Smith? Usually, when we think of the invisible hand, it's described as if people, and maybe this is coming from the Chicago school. I mean, it's so ubiquitous. You don't even know where these things come from, unless you dive into it and write a book, as you have. But it is, my notion of the invisible hand is if all people behave in their own self-interest, somehow things work out and find an equilibrium.
Yeah, that's pretty close. I would put it slightly differently, that people following their own self-interest end up producing socially beneficial consequences without their intention. And I think that's it's a fairly obvious insight about society and how it works, right? That I may unintentionally do something with socially beneficial consequences when I wasn't even intending to. I just was doing something because that was in my self-interest to do so. So that's, I think, the central insight that I think applies to the different uses of the invisible hand. But I think what's interesting, and this is why it's invisible, is that there is a larger social phenomenon that we can't see it's hard for us to see, right, the underlying motivations for. And so that's why it's an invisible thing.
And is that what Adam Smith meant by that? Or is that what he has been interpreted to mean later?
So a lot of the invisible hand interest and interpretations are later ones. There are mentions of the invisible hand in the 18th century and long before. Emma Rothschild's work on the invisible hand, I think it's a 1994 article, and her work on economic sentiments shows that, there's these mentions in Shakespeare's Macbeth, right? The bloody and invisible hand. Oftentimes this image of the invisible hand is providential. It refers to the invisible hand of God. And I think there's a decent amount of scholarly work saying that, Smith probably knew that this was a very common reference and common image. People would have interpreted it as something close to a providential thing. I think there's some healthy debate around that. I'm not sure where I stand, but, I think it's a powerful image. I don't think it's the linchpin of the Wealth of Nations. I think that interpretation, that the invisible hand is the linchpin of the Wealth of Nations, that it is the key insight, the flash of genius, the central thing to understand about Smith, that is a later interpretation.
But it wasn't his. It wasn't central to what he was writing about.
I would say no.
Yeah. Glory Liu, my understanding is you got interested in Adam Smith because of your interest in inequality.
That's right.
Tell me how an interest in inequality leads to Adam Smith.
I was really interested in different arguments for why inequality is bad, in short, right? I went to graduate school right around the time that, President Obama said inequality is the defining issue of our time. And I was deeply interested in theories of poverty and modernization and globalization, and really, really interested in kind of untangling the different moral objections to inequality and the political consequences of inequality. But as somebody who was trained in the history of political thought, I always approach these questions from a really historical perspective. So I used to study the idea of poverty in ancient Athens when I was a classicist. And then I was really interested in the works of the 18th century thinker Thomas Paine and his ideas about kind of a nascent welfare state even, and provisions for the poor. Adam Smith was somebody who was always lurking in the background. And I knew him as kind of the great economic thinker and the author of The Wealth of Nations. But when I started reading a little bit more, and I started to kind of really get sucked into the contemporary Smith scholarship on Smith as a moral philosopher, or as a theorist of justice and political economy, I was really struck by how little I knew about this thinker, and also struck by that that disconnect between the popular image of Smith as free market Smith and this really complicated version of Smith in scholarship. Right, Smith has a theory of justice. He's a political economist. He wrote all these works on jurisprudence and law and politics, and these really striking passages in the theory of moral sentiments where he seems to be deeply concerned about the moral corruption caused by wealth and poverty. And because I think, I was lucky at the time that I got into this, there was so much scholarship really wrestling with these ideas of Smith and corruption and inequality and poverty, that I started to think more and more about that question of how did we get this version of Smith on the one hand, and then this other caricature version of Smith on the other. And rather than kind of doubling down and saying, I'm going to advance my own interpretation of Smith, I really wanted to kind of tell the story of how and why we got this other Smith instead.
Do you have your own interpretation of Adam Smith? And of course, we don't have time to go into that whole...
I do, but I'm still working on it.
Yeah. Glory Liu has been our guest. Again, Glory Liu is a lecturer in social studies at Harvard University, and she has joined us for a conversation about her book called Adam Smith's America: How a Scottish Philosopher Became an Icon of American Capitalism. Glory Liu, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Likewise. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.